Hello everyone and welcome back to Archaeology. My name is Dr. Bill Farley and today I want to talk to you about the best archaeology game ever made. The title of the video sort of suggests that this will be about the selection process for that title, but that's not really true. That's because most games people think of as archaeology games are absolutely terrible archaeology games. Now, the games aren't terrible. I love most of these games, some dearly. They're bad archaeology games because of how they represent the science of archaeology. So let's take a look at some of our competition. Uncharted, Tomb Raider, Lego Indiana Jones, and all the other Indiana Jones games. These, let's be honest here for a second, looting simulators can't hold a candle to the big kid on the block. A game that comes sort of a little close is Mass Effect, more specifically the character arc of Liara T'Soni, who's quite literally a space archaeologist. She's cool. I like Liara a lot, but she's just the alien equivalent of an overexcited first-year graduate student at whatever the most prestigious anthropology program is on Mars or wherever. No, the game I want to talk about today is Outer Wilds. Outer Wilds is what you would have gotten if you had just taken a game about Liara T'Soni, buzzing around the galaxy, peacefully looking at Prothean artifacts without the fear of being shot at. Outer Wilds is the only game I've ever played that makes the player really feel and act like an archaeologist. A real one. It's extremely good. Outer Wilds is a 2019 video game developed by Mobius Digital and published by the twee game darling Annapurna Interactive, who I make fun of constantly despite legitimately believing several of their games in the past few years have been all-timers. Kentucky Route Zero, for instance, is incredible, man. It's like a playable poem. Play that game. No, seriously, go play that game right now. In Outer Wilds, you play as a nameless protagonist from a race of sentient frog-like aliens called the Harthians. By the way, and before I go any further, a quick note. This whole video is going to be mostly spoiler-free. In the next couple paragraphs, I'm going to describe the basic outline of the plot as it's described in the first maybe 15 minutes or so of gameplay. It's actually not necessary for me to get into the details of the plot itself, as it's the gameplay loop that really defines Outer Wilds as a great archaeology game in my opinion. Nonetheless, if you're super spoiler-averse, maybe skip ahead a minute or two, or even just to the next chapter heading that's in the descriptions, to get past any discussion of the plot at all. The gimmick of Outer Wilds is a good one in my opinion. The protagonist is stuck in a time loop that only they are aware of, and I think maybe one or two other characters, but that's not really that important. By the way, as you meet all the Harthians, you might notice they all have they pronouns. It's kinda neat. After 22 minutes of gameplay, the Harthian solar system's sun will go supernova, killing everyone including you. Afterwards, or if you die before the 22 minutes is up, which is actually far more likely, this game is quite hard, and has about 100 unique, interesting ways to kill you, you wake up at the same campfire where the game began. During your first loop, you learn that you're playing as a pioneering astronaut and a member of a species who's just recently discovered spaceflight. After their initial explorations, the Harthians discovered that there was once another occupant of this solar system, the Nomai. Before heading out on their first mission, made special because the protagonist boasts a brand new technology that allows for the deciphering of Nomai writing, you're zapped by a Nomai artifact, which gives you the ability to remember your life between the time loops. After this, you settle into the game's basic structure, wherein you wake up after death, launch into your comically tiny solar system, try desperately to land on a planet without crashing your ship, explore the planet's nooks and crannies for signs of Harthian and Nomai life, try desperately not to be buried by sand, or die from a long fall, or fall into a black hole, or get burnt to death by a meteor or by lava, run out of oxygen and suffocate, or, and this is my personal favorite, forget to put on your spacesuit before exiting your ship and instantly die in the cold depths of space. While doing so, the protagonist slowly explores and studies the history of the now long extinct Nomai, eventually searching for some clue as to how to stop the sun from killing you and all of your loved ones, and subsequently end the time loop. Outer Wilds is no overt narrative. It tells you nothing. You must discover the story and reconstruct the timeline of what happened to the Nomai and why it matters for the survival of the Harthians by reading texts and deciphering the material evidence of their settlements and remains. This is exactly the dynamic that makes Outer Wilds a far better archaeology game than many others, including those that are much more overtly about archaeology. Outer Wilds is not a perfect video game, though. Sometimes when I think about it, I think, I don't even really like it. I'm not even sure I like it. Lots of other people do, though. Really cool people have made it a point in recent years of cracking Outer Wilds onto their lists of greatest games of all time. And alright, I'm willing to admit, it is an absolute all-timer. It can be frustrating to play, though. Something that probably sounds a little bit strange coming from a guy who's bragged in this very channel about platinuming every FromSoft game. But it's kind of maybe too hard. The game can be very punishing, offering numerous unique ways for your unforgivably frail Hearthian to be destroyed by the dangers of space. It takes hours of effort to get comfortable controlling your spacesuit, and many more hours to master the parboiled linguini suit movement of this Blair Witch Project-ass spaceship. Some of the landings were so hard, I actually felt like I was on the mic in 1960s Dallas, quarterbacking the Apollo 11 guys as they calculated a moon landing with the computer equivalent of a TI-83. I don't think this difficulty would be so bothersome if the run back after failing a landing or a tricky rocket jump, and you have to do a lot of tricky rocket jumps, wasn't so long. And failure puts you up against the game's 22-minute Majora's Mask timer gimmick, made even worse when trying to access areas of the game world that are locked to sometimes very brief slices of that clock. For instance, one of the first places you'll probably visit during the period when you're still mastering the game's, I think intentionally clunky controls, is Brittle Hollow, a planet full of long, complex jumping puzzles and every possible Hearthian killing hazard. The game gives you an out of sorts on the jumps because instead of instantly killing you, it warps you literally across the entire solar system through a black hole, requiring you to do more tricky, fuel-heavy movements to even get back to Brittle Hollow, no matter wherever you fell. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, you have limited oxygen and fuel, and if you run out of either, you're probably dead. All that being said, the game completely owns, and I love it. As I'll get to soon, the sense of discovery and general vibes of the game are exquisite. It's an incredibly immersive experience. The characters have wonderful personalities, including those characters who only exist in text. The movement of both the protagonist and the spaceship, which is sort of another protagonist in and of itself, do start to feel good after an admittedly brutal on-ramp, but once they start to feel good, they feel amazing. Mostly, more importantly than anything else, is the music. This game has Toby Fox, Nobuo Uematsu in the 90s tier music. Composer Andrew Pralo has layered a series of motifs over the game in a way that perfectly, synergistically match the game's themes and emotional peaks and valleys. The scoring of the music has it regularly emerge, rise, peak, and fall naturalistically as your rocket launches you off from the launching pad, or you trek down ancient stairs into a mysterious Nomai ruin, and it's masterfully done. The inclusion of folk musical instruments, diegetically included as part of the other Hearthian explorers across the solar system, helps drive home the personality of the Hearthian culture and contrast it with the alien Nomai, an idea brutally important to my thesis of this game as archaeological. This game has music I'll listen to in the car on full blast, and that's a pretty high bar right there for me. Alright, so let's try and fit our look at Outer Wilds into the arc of this series that you're watching. Oftentimes when I teach archaeology, I talk to my students about the three-legged stool of the discipline, and yes, that's exactly as dumb as it sounds. That's on purpose. What I tell them is that every scientific discipline is like a three-legged stool. The science cannot stand without being propped by three equally important aspects: method, ethics, and theory. Method is the doing of a discipline, the actual steps a scientist takes to collect data. This includes both the technology of a science, think anything from a mass spectrometer to a simple shovel, and the technique of data collection. In the case of archaeology, this means how we excavate sites, process artifacts, identify material culture, and how we statistically analyze and ultimately describe that data. I cover this topic extensively in my video about the Uncharted series. Ethics is the why of a discipline. Why are we doing the work that we do? How do we do it in a way that's fair, inclusive, and in a way that doesn't do harm? How do we account for the different stakeholders who are affected by science? Descendant communities, members of the public, at-risk groups who may be targeted based on the conclusions and process of our conducting a science. I talk about ethics at length in my Archaeology of Zelda video. Outer Wilds gives us a chance to touch on that third leg, theory. Theory is the art of interpretation. How do we know what we know, and what can we do with that knowledge? In the case of archaeology, theory is primarily about bridging the gap between the data we collect and an interpretation of human behavior and/or culture. There's a fundamental and frankly humongous gap between the material culture we find and the human cultures we hope to describe or even to reconstruct. Theory helps us to standardize and ultimately argue about what a particular set of artifacts in spatial and temporal context says about a past society. Alright, so what does theory in archaeology look like, and how does Outer Wilds tap into those ideas? Like in any science, theoretical approaches in archaeology are paradigmatic. That means they're bounded in time and occasionally in space. Sometimes theories only gain prevalence in certain countries or regions. Calling the adoption of a theoretical approach a matter of trendiness is going a little bit too far, but only a little. As I said before, a great deal of it is focused on trying to bridge that gap between the partial data that makes up the archaeological record and our ultimate interpretation of what a culture was like. Most textbooks start archaeological theory, at least during the period that archaeology was a recognized subdiscipline of anthropology, with the culture-historical model. Culture historians sought to simply describe the past using the artifacts we find as a mechanism for defining broad cultural traditions, and some form of basic chronology of cultural change and continuity. Made more difficult by this being a half-century before the invention of radiometric techniques like radiocarbon dating. In some ways, the culture-historical model suggests the least distance between data and interpretation. You use the artifacts themselves to describe the past culture. The problem is this has a tendency to sort of rob the past of its humanity. This is where we get the tradition of naming past cultures literally after their technology. The painted pot people, or the stemmed point people, or even better yet, the pre-pottery Neolithic bee people. That last one is a real one. Culture historical models were replaced by so-called processual approaches, or as Lou Binford in a fit of monumental ego called the new archaeology. To be fair, Binford gets credited with actually inventing this term middle range theory that I'm somewhat recklessly borrowing to describe a phenomenon far broader than he intended. Processualism is all about searching for human universals, usually vis-a-vis the environment. The conceit is this: culture, being an exosomatic adaptation, which is a cool term despite being sort of gibberish, will act as an adaptation to the environment in which a culture exists. Thus, if you can determine the environment in the past, you should be able to surmise the processes, or cultural schematics, that underpin that culture's adaptation to this environment. Cool. But how do we know how any culture will adapt to an environment in the first place? Well, Binford argued, you can simply model that based on contemporary societies. This is a technique called ethnographic analogy. In real terms, Binford wanted archaeologists to go and study modern indigenous groups living in different environments around the world so that we could model that behavior back into the deep past. There's some circular logic here, and this theory has been criticized for being ahistorical and for not recognizing the modern pressures placed upon indigenous groups that make their lives incomparable to past peoples. The criticism reached terminal velocity in the 1980s with the emergence of the so-called, creatively, post-processualism. That name both acts as a recognition of its fundamental critique of the new archaeology and aligns it with other post-movements, like postmodernism and post-structuralism. Post-processualists argue for a historical and relative approach that recognizes the unique circumstances of any culture in any time period and broadly rejects the notion of human universals. Thus, we lean on the oft-quoted David Lowenthal by way of L.P. Hartley, "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there." This leaves us with a problem, though. If we can't use modern cultures to determine the shape and character of past societies, how do we bridge the gap? What is our new middle range theory? Well, post-processualists offer a variety of options, and this is where Outer Wilds is going to borrow heavily. Some are pretty logical, such as the direct historical approach, in which an archaeologist relies heavily on the historical record, drawing back in time as far as possible and narrowing the gap of knowledge between what we know and what we cannot possibly know about the past. Outer Wilds utilizes historical records as one of its main devices, fleshing out not only the moment-to-moment history of the Nomai and their life in the Harthian system, but also giving glimpses of their interpersonal relationships, their perspectives on the nature of knowledge and technology, and ultimately on their spirituality. Archaeologists are increasingly interested in the adaptation of oral historical approaches as well, a general recognition of the infallibility of historical documentation, and part of a trend towards anti-colonial processes that effectively silence indigenous people in the past and present. Outer Wilds mostly presents us this interaction with the Harthians themselves, many of whom speak of ancient Harthian traditions and even their evolutionary development, which in turn arch parallel to the story and themes of the Nomai's residents in this same solar system. Post-processualists are altogether more interested in semiotic, symbolic, and ontological explanations for past behavior than earlier archaeologists. Now, right from the start, we can recognize that that's a whole bunker blaster bucket full of terminology. Semiotic, ontologic, what are we getting at here? The long and short is that archaeologists now generally try to understand past cultures within their own relative framework by deciphering those cultures' own means of symbolic communication and their own ways of knowing themselves and their worlds. How did past cultures view themselves? How did they construct their symbolic and physical worlds? If the past is really a foreign country, could we even understand it even if we did have a time machine? These are still open questions in archaeological theory, and I certainly don't have answers for them. Again, though, Outer Wilds does a marvelous job juggling this uncertainty. Even with magical technology that allows the protagonist to decipher ancient text instantaneously, every document, symbol, and structure we find feels appropriately, well, alien. The Nomai lived and thought differently from the Harthians, or us humans for that matter, and deconstructing the protagonist and our own expectations is key to unraveling the mysteries at the core of the Outer Wilds story. It's useful to once more compare Outer Wilds to other archaeology games by thinking about what those games do poorly, or at least less well. Most other games, for example, overestimate the value of historical knowledge and the inherent honesty of any historical documentation. Any historian will tell you that the key to being a good historian is a healthy critical eye, a recognition that any written record is fallible, either because of overt misrepresentation or simply as a result of them being written by fallible human beings. So many games ask us to accept the honesty of past narrators to drive their plots and communicate our character forward through the plot. The Nomai don't really lie to the protagonist of Outer Wilds. That would probably come across as sort of schlocky. I'm looking at you, BioShock. Instead, quite realistically, the Nomai writings are full of individual biases and worries, and the Nomai's lack of understanding of their own demise is apparent throughout. The twists and turns of this game's plot don't come from some all-powerful antagonist purposely misleading us, but instead from the very human misconceptions of these flawed ancient people. Most other games also vastly overestimate the value of common sense, theoretical approaches to understanding the past. I can't overestimate how dangerous this is. The common refrain of the anti-theorist is, I don't need this complicated theory crap, I can use my common sense. Your common sense is worse than worthless. Common sense is theory. It's just theory that is born entirely out of bias. It's simply representation of your condensed cultural experience and knowledge. We are cultural beings, and our knowledge is steeped in our own cultural expectations. If we accept the past is not the same as today, then applying our common sense to it will always result in an entirely biased interpretation. Outer Wilds gets this, and it even uses it to subvert the player's expectations by repeatedly letting us think we know what's going on, only to later throw a curveball in the form of the Nomai's very different perspectives leading to unexpected outcomes. In the end, Outer Wilds is the best archaeology game because it's the most like real archaeology. It presents very realistic challenges that stem from the partial nature of the archaeological and historical records, and the struggle we have to overcome our own biases as researchers. So what can Outer Wilds teach us about archaeology, and by extension, why do I think it's the best archaeology video game? Outer Wilds is honest about the challenges of archaeological interpretation. There really is nothing simple or easy in looking at material culture left behind and using it to discern a culture's structure or character. You should frankly be very suspicious of anyone who tells you otherwise. When you see someone on Twitter or, God forbid, ancient goddamned aliens just looking at some quirky artifact or document and claiming their common sense is more than enough to tell you whatever harebrained interpretation they're presenting, you should be suspicious. They're selling you something. No, the ancient Egyptians didn't have toaster ovens or hair dryers or whatever the hell this guy is telling you. Archaeological interpretation requires us to constantly reckon with our own biases and assumptions. I can't stress this enough. This is a constant process for archaeologists. We're doing it all the time, and it is the only thing that separates us from this guy. Archaeological interpretation depends entirely upon the data available to us in any circumstance, and will always require us to implement a combination of objective and subjective analysis. Outer Wilds, in the end, is honest about this. Its gameplay challenge, the constant fumbling and crashing and dying and being reborn with scraps of knowledge that seemingly no one believes, a useful simulacrum of the eternal struggle of archaeologists versus data. Ultimately, archaeologists have argued with each other over a century for a reason. This stuff is hard. There is no purely objective, scientific truth about the past. The gaps in the data will always represent too wide a gulf for us to leap, no matter how low the proverbial gravity of the situation. Archaeological theory is the bridge that covers the gap between what was and what we can say about what was. It's often a rickety bridge, an Indiana Jonesian scrapyard haphazardly slapped together by the certifiably insane. But it remains the only bridge we've got.